June 1940, Dunkirk. The beach is chaos. Thousands of British soldiers, trapped, waiting for the retreat they never expected. Overhead, the shriek of diving bombers echoes across the darkening sky, the smoke rising in plumes behind them. The sound of gunfire is constant, a reminder of how close the enemy is. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, the British soldiers remain calm, organized, resilient. The German generals watching from afar cannot understand it. They had expected a rapid collapse. The British forces, pushed to the edge, should have surrendered. But instead, they are pulling off an evacuation under fire, a feat of logistical precision against all odds that they never anticipated. As German forces advance, something begins to shift in the high command. What began as a calculation of easy victory starts to feel like an unknown. The British, who had been underestimated, were not breaking. They were enduring. The realization begins to dawn. This war would not be won by speed alone. The true strength of the British Army was not in numbers or immediate force. It was in their will, and that was something no one had prepared for. When war broke out in September 1939, German confidence rested on experience and momentum. The campaigns that followed appeared to confirm every assumption held by the Wehrmacht's senior leadership. Poland collapsed in weeks. The combination of armored thrusts, close air support, and rapid encirclement shattered resistance before it could reorganize. To German generals, this was not merely success. It was proof that modern war favored decisiveness and speed above all else. Britain did not appear built for such a war. From Berlin, the British Army looked small, cautious, and psychologically burdened by the memory of the First World War. Its interwar doctrine emphasized defense, preservation, and imperial policing rather than continental offensives. German intelligence reports describe British society as weary, its politics divided, its military leadership constrained by tradition rather than innovation. The deployment of the British Expeditionary Force to France in 1939 did little to alter that perception. British units fought competently, but without the aggressive posture Germany had come to expect from serious opponents. When the German offensive began in May 1940, it unfolded faster than even its architects had predicted. The Ardennes breakthrough cut the Allied armies in half. Communications collapsed. Retreat became unavoidable. To German generals, Britain's position appeared hopeless. Cut off from its allies, pushed toward the sea, facing annihilation or surrender, the British army seemed poised to exit the war entirely. History offered precedent. France had fallen. Smaller powers had folded. Logic suggested Britain would follow. What German planners failed to account for was how British military culture interpreted defeat. Retreat was not synonymous with collapse. Withdrawal did not mean surrender. The evacuation at Dunkirk was not planned as a triumph. It was conceived as a necessity. But in execution, it revealed a capacity for organization, discipline, and collective endurance that contradicted German expectations. In Berlin, this outcome created discomfort rather than alarm. The evacuation was viewed as an escape, not a victory. British forces had abandoned heavy equipment. France was collapsing. Strategically, Germany still appeared dominant. Yet something had changed. German generals began to recognize that British resistance operated on a different logic. The British army had not been designed to win quickly. It had been shaped to endure setbacks without disintegration. Where German doctrine sought decisive battles, British doctrine emphasized survival, continuity, and time. This distinction would soon matter. As Britain regrouped, reorganized, and prepared for the next phase of the war, German leadership faced an opponent whose strength was not visible in early engagements, but whose persistence would gradually undermine assumptions formed during those first months of rapid victory. And that realization would deepen as the war shifted from continental blitzkrieg to a broader struggle in which resilience became as important as maneuver. By the summer of 1940, the strategic map of Europe had changed beyond recognition. France had fallen, the Low Countries were occupied, German forces stood on the Channel coast, facing Britain across a narrow strip of water. To many within the German high command, the war appeared effectively decided. Britain's continued resistance was interpreted not as strength but as denial. Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain, was discussed with confidence but little urgency. German generals assumed that political collapse would precede any need for landings. The Royal Air Force would be destroyed. The population would demand peace. Britain's leadership, isolated and unsupported, would eventually concede. These assumptions were shaped by misunderstanding. British military culture was deeply influenced by imperial experience. For decades, British forces had operated far from home, often outnumbered, relying on discipline, logistics, and cohesion rather than overwhelming force. Survival under pressure was not an anomaly. It was institutional memory. The Battle of Britain would expose this difference. Beginning in July 1940, the Luftwaffe launched sustained attacks aimed at neutralizing British air power. German commanders believed that air superiority would break resistance quickly. Losses were expected, but victory was assumed. The Royal Air Force, smaller and under constant strain, appeared vulnerable, yet British pilots continued to rise. Radar stations remained operational. Aircraft production replaced losses at a pace German intelligence underestimated. Squadrons rotated, command and control held. What unsettled German leadership was not merely that Britain survived, but that it adapted. Tactical errors were corrected. Defensive systems improved under pressure. Civilian morale predicted to collapse under bombing instead hardened. Reports reaching Berlin described a population absorbing punishment without visible panic. Industrial output continued, recruitment increased, the expected fracture did not appear.
This pattern repeated beyond the air war. In North Africa, British forces endured logistical hardship, extreme terrain, and early setbacks, yet they did not dissolve. Units withdrew, reformed, and returned. The Eighth Army absorbed defeat without losing coherence. German commanders accustomed to wars of rapid decision began to confront an unfamiliar opponent. Britain did not seek dramatic victories. It sought continuity. Every day Britain remained in the war was treated as success. Leadership reinforced this approach. British command emphasized persistence over spectacle. Time was weaponized. Delay became strategy. The objective was not to win immediately, but deny Germany finality. By late 1941, German generals increasingly recognized that Britain was fighting a different war, one shaped not by rapid conquest but by endurance and resolve. This realization did not come through a single event, but through accumulation. Each failed prediction forced reassessment. Each expectation of collapse unmet introduced doubt. And as German forces expanded into new theaters, the question became unavoidable. If Britain could not be broken quickly, what truly sustained its soldiers under such pressure? The answer would emerge not from ideology or propaganda, but from repeated encounters that revealed the human, tactical, and moral foundations of British resistance. Angle 1. The human foundation of British endurance. To German generals trained in decisive maneuver, British soldiers often appeared restrained, less theatrical, less aggressive. Early intelligence assessments mistook this restraint for weakness. What they gradually discovered was something else entirely. Discipline rooted in routine rather than emotion. British soldiers were trained to function under prolonged stress. Drill emphasized repetition. Command emphasized reliability. Orders were designed to be followed even when conditions deteriorated. This created units that did not collapse when plans failed. They adjusted quietly and continued. In North Africa, German officers noted that British units rarely panicked after defeat. They withdrew in order, reassembled, and returned. Losses were absorbed psychologically as well as materially. The British soldiers' motivation was not blind zeal, but obligation to unit, regiment, and task. This sense of duty, reinforced by regimental identity and shared hardship, sustained morale even when victory seemed distant. Angle 2. Tactical patience over brilliance. German doctrine prized initiative and rapid exploitation. British doctrine, shaped by experience, valued holding ground, conserving force, and wearing the enemy down. This approach often appeared passive, but it created resilience. British commanders accepted temporary setbacks if they preserved combat power. They avoided encirclement. They favored defense in depth. When opportunities emerged, they were exploited deliberately rather than impulsively. German generals began to recognize this patience as intentional. British forces were not failing to act. They were choosing when to act. Angle 3.
Leadership and moral clarity. British leadership communicated purpose without illusion. Soldiers were not promised easy victory. They were told the war would be long. Survival itself became a form of resistance. This honesty mattered. It reduced shock when conditions worsened. German commanders observed that British units fought on, even when strategic outlooks were bleak, not because they believed collapse was impossible, but because endurance itself was meaningful. What sustained British soldiers was not optimism, but acceptance. And as these human and tactical factors combined, German generals began to confront a deeper question. How could an army that rarely sought decisive moments still deny them victory? The answer lay in forces beyond individual courage. Systems, logistics, and command philosophy that magnified endurance into strategic power. Angle 4. Systems that protected the soldier. What unsettled German generals most was not British bravery, but British continuity. Units returned to the line intact even after defeat because the systems behind them held. Supply chains functioned, medical evacuation worked, reinforcements arrived predictably. Wounded soldiers were treated, returned, or replaced without chaos. British logistics lacked the spectacle of German armored thrusts, but it delivered reliability. Food arrived, ammunition was rationed but steady. Equipment shortages were acknowledged and mitigated. The British soldier fought with the understanding that he would not be abandoned when conditions worsened. German commanders, accustomed to improvisation under pressure, began to recognize this predictability as a form of strength. Angle 5. The enemy's misreading of motivation. German ideology struggled to explain British endurance. The British soldier did not fight for territorial expansion or revolutionary vision. He fought to hold ground, protect comrades, and deny defeat. This defensive motivation proved difficult to break. Interrogations of British prisoners revealed calm rather than desperation. Captured soldiers spoke of duty, rotation, and eventual return. There was little talk of collapse or surrender. This steadiness disturbed German officers more than defiance would have. The absence of fanaticism did not reduce resolve, it stabilized it. Angle 6. Learning without collapse. Perhaps the most significant factor was Britain's ability to learn without disintegrating. Defeats produced inquiry, not purges. Commanders were replaced when necessary, but institutions remained intact. Tactical lessons spread quickly through training and doctrine. German generals observed that British units improved steadily across campaigns. Early failures in France did not define later performance in Africa or Europe. Adaptation occurred within continuity, not through radical reinvention. By the time these patterns became clear, German leadership faced an uncomfortable truth. Britain's strength did not lie in moments of brilliance,
but in a structure designed to absorb pressure indefinitely. And as the war entered its most decisive phase, this quiet resilience would intersect with moments of confrontation, where endurance alone would shape outcomes on a scale that German commanders could no longer dismiss. The turning point for Germany's understanding of British resolve came in the spring of 1941, during the North African campaign, where German forces under Erwin Rommel had dominated the desert, but found themselves stymied by the British Eighth Army. At the start of the campaign, the Germans anticipated a swift victory. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox for his audacity and speed, had already inflicted significant losses on British forces in the early months of the war. He expected no serious resistance in North Africa, particularly after the fall of France. But the British presence in North Africa was far from broken. The Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 would eventually become a defining moment of the conflict, but the initial shock to Rommel came much earlier. The British, led by General Bernard Montgomery, had reorganized their forces and adapted quickly. German intelligence had underestimated British resolve in this harsh environment. The logistical challenges of the desert, the extreme heat, and the long supply lines should have fractured British morale, but they didn't. By early 1941, after a string of tactical defeats in the Western Desert, British forces were still holding their ground and gradually turning the tide. The Germans had anticipated that the British would buckle under the weight of attrition. What Rommel's forces encountered instead were soldiers who, although weary and outgunned in some cases, didn't retreat. They dug in, held their positions, and counterattacked with unyielding persistence. Rommel himself acknowledged the grit of the British soldier in his reports. Despite being unable to deliver a crushing blow, the Germans were finding it difficult to break the British front. What struck Rommel and his officers most was not the British capacity for victory, but their doggedness in the face of overwhelming odds. This moment of realization marked a crucial shift in German strategic thinking. It was clear that the British were not fighting for swift victory, they were fighting for survival, and they could endure far longer than the Germans had initially believed possible. As the Battle of El Alamein neared, German morale began to slip. Intelligence reports from the field showed that even in retreat, the British forces continued to push forward. British soldiers had come to see the war not as a series of tactical victories, but as a fight they simply could not afford to lose. For German generals, this realization was a stark departure from their initial underestimation. The belief that Britain could be broken through conventional means of attrition was no longer viable. This would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Axis in North Africa. The Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 became the defining turning point of the North African campaign, and its implications reverberated deeply through the German command. For the first time, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery demonstrated that they could hold their ground and even counterattack successfully against Rommel's seemingly unstoppable Afrika Korps. By this stage, the Germans had grown accustomed to quick, decisive victories. The idea that British forces could endure, reorganize, and return to the battlefield with renewed strength shattered long-held assumptions. In the weeks leading up to the battle, Rommel had advanced further into Egypt, pushing British forces back and bringing the Axis within sight of the Suez Canal, a vital strategic point. The situation appeared increasingly dire for the British. Yet in this moment of crisis, the British resolve did not falter. It solidified. Montgomery, fully aware of the logistical and moral importance of the battle, had prepared not only his forces but also the civilian population for the long haul. He understood that British resilience, embodied in the soldiers' willingness to endure, would be the foundation of victory. Montgomery's meticulous preparations were not just about tacticals or manpower, but about building a sense of unity within his forces. The goal was not to crush Rommel in a single decisive blow, but to wear him down. Every day the British stood their ground, the Axis position in North Africa weakened. This slow, methodical buildup became the strategy that proved most effective. For Rommel and his generals, it became increasingly clear that they were facing an opponent who would not concede defeat easily. The British had, over the course of the war, developed the ability to learn from setbacks, adapt, and most importantly, never yield. Rommel's frustrations were palpable as he encountered British resistance that had outlasted the German ability to surprise. The tactical success of El Alamein was not just in the victory itself, but in the demonstration that Britain could absorb blows and keep fighting. German commanders, who had long believed that morale could be broken through sheer force, were now forced to confront the reality that British soldiers had a psychological resilience beyond what they had anticipated. They were not fighting for the immediate triumph, but for the preservation of the British way of life, and this proved to be a powerful motivator. The British Army did not view retreat as defeat, they viewed it as an opportunity to regroup and re-engage. The consequences of El Alamein were profound. It marked the beginning of the Allied push westward in Africa, and it emboldened British and Allied forces, signaling that victory was possible, even against overwhelming odds. For German generals, the loss at El Alamein wasn't merely a setback, it was an awakening. Their previous assumptions about British resolve were shattered. They had underestimated their enemy's endurance, and now they had to reckon with it. In the aftermath, the Axis position in North Africa slowly began to crumble. The defeat at El Alamein was followed by the Allied invasion of French North Africa in November 1942, opening a new front that further stretched Axis resources. Germany, already overextended in Russia, could not afford to lose the African theater, but now it was clear British resilience, fueled by the knowledge that defeat was not an option, had changed the tide. The consequences of German misjudgment did not end with defeat in the desert. They unfolded steadily, shaping German strategy and psychology across every remaining front of the war. After El Alamein, the Axis position in North Africa deteriorated rapidly. Rommel's forces,
already strained by long supply lines and fuel shortages, could no longer maneuver with freedom. British and Allied pressure increased methodically. The tempo of operations was set not by ambition, but by sustainability. Each withdrawal by Axis forces was followed by British consolidation, reinforcement, and renewed advance. For German generals, this pattern was deeply unsettling. British operations lacked dramatic flair, yet they were relentless. There was no moment to recover initiative. The British did not rush. They advanced when ready, paused when necessary, and resumed without loss of cohesion. The war was no longer moving in sudden leaps, it was grinding forward. This shift forced Germany to reconsider its broader strategy. Resources diverted to Africa could not be replaced. Aircraft and armor sent south were unavailable elsewhere. As losses mounted, German leadership faced hard limits imposed by industrial capacity and overstretched logistics. More troubling was the psychological dimension. British endurance undermined German expectations of morale collapse. The British Army had not only survived defeat in France, it had absorbed years of pressure without fracturing. This resilience emboldened Allied planning and complicated Axis forecasting. Reports from German officers increasingly described British troops as dependable, disciplined, and stubbornly resistant to intimidation. These were not emotional assessments, they were operational conclusions drawn from repeated engagement. The British soldier fought with an understanding that the war would be long and that patience itself was a weapon. As Allied forces pushed Axis troops westward across North Africa, German generals recognized that they were confronting an opponent who measured success not by rapid victory, but by sustained presence. Every month Britain remained in the war strengthened its position. Every delay weakened Germany's. The Axis defeat in Africa would soon culminate in surrender, but the deeper impact lay elsewhere. British resilience had reshaped Allied confidence and exposed a flaw in German assumptions that could not be corrected quickly. And as the war expanded into southern Europe, that same British endurance would reappear, now reinforced by growing Allied strength, ensuring that Germany faced not isolated opponents, but a coalition built to outlast it. By 1943, the strategic consequences of Britain's endurance were fully visible. The Axis defeat in North Africa did more than eliminate a theater, it altered the balance of initiative. German generals no longer planned on decisive outcomes, they planned on delay. The surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia marked the first complete destruction of a German field army. It was not lost in a single catastrophic battle, but worn down through sustained pressure. British and Allied forces advanced with coordination that denied recovery. Supply routes were severed. Air superiority tightened, options narrowed until none remained. For German leadership, this outcome confirmed what earlier encounters had suggested. Britain could not be broken through exhaustion. Attrition favored the side that could endure longer, and Britain had demonstrated that it could. This realization shaped German decision-making elsewhere. Defensive pastures hardened, resources were spread thinner, strategic risk-taking diminished. The war became reactive. German generals increasingly fought to avoid collapse rather than to impose defeat. British forces, by contrast, carried forward a confidence rooted not in invincibility, but in proven survival. Campaigns in Italy reflected the same pattern seen in Africa. Progress was slow, losses were real, but momentum was preserved. British units absorbed hardship without disintegration, allowing Allied pressure to remain constant. German assessments of British soldiers changed permanently. Early stereotypes of fragility and indecision were replaced by recognition of discipline, cohesion, and moral steadiness. British soldiers were understood as reliable under fire, resistant to panic, and capable of sustaining operations even when conditions offered little immediate reward. This shift in perception mattered. It influenced how German commanders allocated forces, anticipated resistance, and judged the feasibility of prolonged operations. Britain was no longer viewed as a temporary obstacle, but as a permanent factor in the war. The cumulative effect of this recognition extended beyond Britain itself. British endurance kept the Western Front alive long enough for American power to enter decisively. Time, Britain's most consistent weapon, had been spent wisely. And as Germany faced mounting pressure from all directions, the importance of those early months, when Britain chose endurance over surrender, became unmistakable. The realization that unsettled German generals was not that British soldiers were fearless, or even that they were exceptionally skilled. It was something more difficult to counter. British soldiers fought with the expectation of hardship, not the promise of triumph. They did not measure success by how quickly the war could be won, but by whether they could continue when conditions offered no reason for optimism. This mindset shaped everything that followed. Britain did not rely on early victories to sustain morale, it relied on continuity.
Units withdrew without collapsing. Losses were absorbed without illusion. Leadership spoke of endurance rather than glory, and soldiers internalized that the war was not a test of brilliance, but of persistence. German strategy, built on speed and decisive outcomes, struggled to adapt to an enemy that denied finality. Britain's refusal to break forced the war into a form Germany was least prepared to fight. A prolonged struggle measured in time, resources, and resilience. Every month Britain remained active reduced German options and expanded Allied opportunity. What truly drove British soldiers forward was not desperation, nor ideology, nor the expectation of swift victory. It was a quiet certainty that surrender would end everything they were fighting to preserve. Endurance became duty, survival became resistance. By the time German generals understood this, the balance had already shifted. Britain had bought time. Time for adaptation, alliance, and ultimately, overwhelming force. The war would still demand sacrifice, but its outcome was no longer shaped by early assumptions. In the end, British soldiers did not need to defeat Germany quickly. They only needed to remain standing. And that proved enough to change the course of the war.